Feelings are real, and so are the relations which are known along with them. And in another extraordinarily famous passage, James writes, we ought to say a feeling of and, a feeling of if, a feeling of but, and a feeling of by, quite as readily as we say a feeling of blue or a feeling of cold. Yet we do not. So inveterate has our habit become of recognizing the existence of the substantive parts alone, that language almost refuses to lend itself to any other use. James notes that there is a fringe around every object, or a fringe around every focus. So we typically focus on the objects or the events that we're interested in. A person, a car, a street sign, a breeze on our face. But so much more is involved in anything we think about. James wants us to consider this, what he calls the fringe. So in some ways, the fringe can be understood literally. It's what's around a thing, the background, if you will. But James considers it as much more deeply intermixed or involved in what it is we experience at any moment. Consider his examples, the different reactions we have when we hear people say, wait, or hark, or look. In each of those cases, James writes, quote, our consciousness is thrown into three quite different attitudes of expectancy, although no definite object is before it in any one of the three cases. Another example he gives is when we try to recall a name we've forgotten. Here he says, the state of our consciousness is peculiar. There is a gap therein, but no mere gap. It is a gap that is intensely active. A sort of wraith of the name is in it, beckoning us in a given direction, making us at moments tingle with the sense of our closeness, and then letting us sink back without the longed-for term. If wrong names are proposed to us, this singularly definite gap acts immediately so as to negate them. They do not fit into its mold, and the gap of one word does not feel like the gap of another, all empty of content, as both might seem necessarily to be when described as gaps. End quote. So this is what James does so well. He makes plain something that we all experience in our mental life, which we know extremely well, but he describes them with precision and with color. He brings the real but inarticulate to language, into focus, you might say. You might consider some additional examples, as when we get what someone is trying to say to us, even if they've only said a couple of words, or they've said it in a kind of an awkward way. James says we might twig it. Now, we might use different language. We might say, if to someone who's trying to get an idea or a notion across to us, I feel you, or I get what you're saying. James adds another example. He adds the case when we are reading something. Maybe we're reading aloud for the first time. We can do a decent job with it even though we don't yet know what it's going to say. A reader from the very first moment, James says, has a sense of at least the form of the sentence yet to come. And so his point here is that we have these and many other experiences, but they do not consist in definite sensory images, impressions, and ideas as traditional empiricism had it. Indeed, he writes, quote, one may admit that a good third of our psychic life consists in these rapid, premonitory perspective views of schemes of thought not yet articulate. James also takes some time to explain how the fringe plays out in our brain actions, as he calls them, and the topic that we're concerned with in a given episode of thinking. Now, it's very typical in epistemology to distinguish between knowledge of acquaintance and knowledge about. And in knowledge of acquaintance, we might only have a passing familiarity with something. We don't truly know it. We wouldn't say that. Now, typically theories of knowledge say that to know something is to know about its intrinsic or essential properties. But here James wants to explain the difference between acquaintance and knowledge about in terms of its relations, right? He says when we know something, it's not because we know its intrinsic or essential properties of the thing itself, but because we have a greater knowledge of the number and quality of the relations with which we can connect it. We can understand this, he says, by considering how we stay on a topic, let's say in a story that we're telling or an argument that we're making. When we go off on a tangent or we add a side fact or a detail, we come back to the topic because we understand that as the center in a web of relations. In other words, it's the whole web that plays a role in knowing something. The fringe is as important as the focus, and the focus only is what it is because of everything else to which it's related. Selecting, ignoring, and forgetting are all very important to consciousness. James wants us to understand that to have a consciousness is to have this active ability to welcome some things, reject some things, choose some things as it's thinking. Our minds are really so much more than sort of spotlights that land on objects out in the world. Our minds are constantly at work choosing, selecting, ignoring, accentuating certain things, emphasizing certain things, maybe downplaying certain things. So what philosophers especially need to understand is that not only our senses are selective, but when we notice something and we pay attention to it, we might say, we are selecting yet again. So we call something into focus, and then we focus further on what we call essential. But this is really, to call something essential is really much more to celebrate our choice than it's an indication of what's really real. James says, attention, out of all these sensations yielded, picks out certain ones as worthy of notice and suppresses all the rest. We notice only those sensations which are signs to us of things which happen practically or aesthetically to interest us, to which we therefore give substantive names, and which we exalt to this exclusive status of independence and dignity. And then what happens? The mind selects again. It chooses certain of the sensations to represent the thing most truly, and it considers the rest as its appearances, modified by the conditions of the moment. Thus my tabletop is named square, and all the other retinal sensations are called perspective views. Or the real color of the brick is the sensation that it gives when the eye looks squarely at it from a near point out of the sunshine and not in the gloom. The mind chooses to suit itself, and it decides what particular sensation shall be held more real and valid than the rest. So this discussion of attention leads James to reinforce a point that he's made elsewhere. Rationality is a way of connecting selected things that interest us, so we can fulfill ends that we have. They could be aesthetic ends, they could be ethical ends, they could be personal ends. Our choice, our selection leads to action. Choice makes us into what we will become. So attention leads to rational choice and to character. This is a long way of saying you are what you do. And often we attend to similar things and we do similar things. So although we have personal consciousnesses, there's a lot of similarity between us. Finally, James ends the essay with one final distinction which he argues is ironclad in our psychological makeup. We all draw a line in our experience between what is me and what is not me. And he says, even the trodden worm, as Lotze says somewhere, contrasts his own suffering self with the whole remaining universe, though he have no clear conception either of himself or of what the universe may be. He is for me a mere part of the world. For him it is I who am the mere part. Each of us dichotomizes the cosmos in a different place. So I hope this gave you a good introduction to William James's The Stream of Consciousness. Thank you for listening, thank you for watching, and I hope we'll have a nice conversation about this.